Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the world champion Buffalo Wings. We just concluded the 2036 season with our Buffalo Wings winning a second world title in the last 3 years. And the offseason is about to begin, but before the hard work begins, gonna do an annual tradition here and take a look at our farm system, take a look at some of the top prospects throughout baseball, and also take a look at some of the players from our own system that we have traded away or moved on from in recent years to see how they did in this recently completed 2036 season. So at this point, our farm system is ranked fourth in Major League Baseball, and you can see we've got five top 51 prospects, led by Joe Gallagher, who made his Major League debut towards the end of this season, hit a ridiculous 74 homers in 2035 between four levels of the minors. This year combined for 64 between AAA Albany and the majors. There's no question about his bat. Have some concerns about his attitude, his lack of speed, and his very mediocre to poor defense. But hard to imagine a scenario where he will not be a important player for us at the major league level this upcoming season, particularly if we don't try to re-engage with our previous DH, Shamar Jenneret, who just opted out of the last 4 years of his contract. Gallagher will be 24 years old, obviously has nothing left to prove in the minor leagues, and I think he could be a pretty cost-effective replacement to Jenneret at DH for us. So I think that is probably the plan. Gallagher is a guy who we picked in the 9th round just 2+ years ago, 298th pick overall. Someone who, coming out of the University of Central Missouri, has just had talent change randomness work massively in his favor for us. Alexis Mendoza is another blue chip prospect. He was a 4th round pick in 2032, now considered the number 22 prospect in baseball. Was 5-7 with a 4.65 ERA in AAA Albany. The only concern is that he tore his labrum back in July, so he missed about half of the season. If his profile looks somewhat similar to what we think it is today on the other side of that injury, he is likely to be with the major league club next year. And if we end up having to move on from Jorge Carrillo, who is a free agent this year that we might not be able to afford, it's conceivable that Mendoza will be making his major league debut at the end of spring training as a member of our starting rotation. So while Gallagher and Mendoza are at the majors or close to the majors, the rest of our top prospects are unfortunately probably a few years away. First baseman David Mendoza, a scouting discovery from almost 3 years ago. Number 33 prospect in baseball, but he definitely had a tough time of it this past year. We promoted him when he was 18 to our DSL team. Did have 8 homers and 30 ribbies in 185 at-bats, but he also struck out 116 times and batted just a $130. So clearly need to hope that contact and avoid strikeout ratings in particular improve. Relative to the DSL, the contact and avoid strikeouts are the issues. The rest of his categories are kind of at the level where he should be a competent player. Hopefully he will continue to improve next year. Clearly seems like a while till he'd be able to contribute at the major league level. Guadalupe Amezcua is another scouting discovery, the number 43 prospect in baseball. Had his second year in the DSL this year, and he's another guy who's struggling to hit for average and struggling to avoid strikeouts. Second straight year striking out in more than half of his at-bats, and he got the batting average up 12 points to a $169. So clearly a lot of work to be done with Mr. Amezcua. And then the final of our top 100 prospects is Eric Barbarito. He was a first round pick of ours in 2033, number 34 overall. Split this past year between A ball and high A ball, 6-3 with a 2.90 ERA in A, 5-3 with a 4.81 ERA in high A ball, and his advanced metrics were definitely all weaker in high A ball as well. That said, he's 22 years old. He's a durable guy, good personality, throwing in the mid to high 90s. Needs to work on his control. He combined for 104 walks between those two levels. Fortunately, he combined for a crazy 269 strikeouts between those two levels. So if he is able to harness his control and also avoid giving up so many home runs, still has some potential. He's got 3 pitches that we think right now are above average major league pitches. His control is the biggest concern right now, but he is a guy who maybe 2 years from now could potentially be helping us if he develops the way that we hope he will. And although we've got those 5 top 51 prospects who are kind of the crown jewels of our system, we only have 3 other guys who are in the top 200. Josh Nagy, you may remember him, the first rounder this past season, who we picked 34th overall. He was 4-2 with a 4.23 ERA in rookie ball at the age of 18. Did strike out more than a batter per inning, but also walked 30. His control is the concern. We knew that was the concern when we picked him up. Hopefully his control will continue to be better or get better. And hopefully with good coaching in the minors and maybe a bit of luck, his top-end control may be better than we think it will be. Not a horrible professional debut for Nagy, but clearly what we're going to be watching with him is how many walks he gives up in the coming years. Jim Lance should also be familiar because he's a guy we considered where we picked Nagy, and he ended up falling to us in the second round where we were happy to bring another pitching prospect on board. He was not as successful as Nagy, 1-2 with a 6.16 ERA. Struck out a great 12.1 per 9 innings, but walked an extremely sickly 8.3 walks per 9 innings. We think that if he fully develops, his control has more potential to get to a reasonable level than Nagy. Definitely doesn't have the same kind of upside as far as his stuff, but another guy who is at least interesting prospect for us to follow over the next few years. And then David Espinoza, third round pick back in 2032, split this past year between Utica and Albany, 7-6 with a 3.38 ERA, more than a strikeout per inning, and pretty good advanced metrics in Utica. And then 5-0 at Albany with a 4.50 ERA, but 75 strikeouts in 54 innings. Advanced metrics still above average for that league. I don't think he's ever going to be an ace, but he's another left-handed arm which we could look to add. Tons of stamina, great at holding on runners. I think he's a back of the rotation guy, maybe a 4th or 5th starter if he fully develops. He could be a guy, if our pitching staff is looking good, who ends up becoming a useful left-handed arm out of the bullpen. Not inconceivable that Mr. Espinoza could be asked to help us by September call-ups of the upcoming 2037 season. And I'm not going to go through all the rest of the top prospects in our system, but I'll highlight a few who are close to being able to help us, or players that we've talked about a lot in the past. Tegan Tiley was our first round pick out of Canada in 2031, and he finally made it to AAA this year where he hit 274, 26 doubles, 11 homers. He was a below average offensive player, and looking at his profile, best case scenario is probably he's average-ish offensively at the major league level if he completely develops all of the untapped potential that we think he has. He is fragile in terms of his injury proneness, but he's also a guy who at this point we have trained up to play every position in the infield. So at the very least, I think Tiley should be in the mix for a utility infield spot for us in the coming years. And in a perfect development scenario, particularly if we have some injuries or we have to move on from some of our current infielders, he could man a starting spot, most likely at second or third base for us at some time in the coming years. We'll touch on Jesus Rivera just because he was a pretty prominent international free agent signing of ours a couple years ago. He finally made it out of rookie ball this year, and in a abbreviated kind of half a year in A ball, struggled, hitting just a .196 with 5 homers and 163 at bats. We really like his defensive capabilities. Question is how much he's going to hit. He's still got a lot of growth that needs to happen in terms of his home run power, his eye, and his ability to avoid strikeouts to potentially be a useful major league player. No guarantees that he's going to make it, but we're going to keep investing in him and ensuring he gets significant playing time. Ben Elmquist was our first round pick in 2034 out of Lander University. Split this year between AA Utica, where he hit .261 with 16 homers and 368 at-bats, was a little bit above average offensively, and then we promoted him up to AAA Albany at the end of the year, hit .348 with a homer in a very small sample size, just 46 at-bats. Still looks like someone who could be a useful bat in the outfield, like his outfield range. Don't love the lack of home run power and particularly the poor eye. Looks like a guy who could hit for a pretty decent average if everything goes well. And he could be a guy who could hit 15, 18, maybe 20 home runs at the major league level in a best case scenario if he continues to develop his home run power a little better. I think in a perfect world, he's a really nice utility outfielder with that range. Would prefer that he doesn't end up as a starter with the way his profile looks, which is admittedly disappointing for a guy we picked with the first round choice. But you don't win them all, unfortunately. You may remember Alexis Mazuka, a guy who was looking for big money that we ended up taking in the 5th round a year and a half ago when he slid. He hit .230 this year in rookie ball. If he fully develops, he's almost an Elmquist type of guy. Pretty good outfield range and could make decent contact. The question is how much he's going to walk and whether he's going to have much home run power. Another guy who looks like he could be a useful major league player in a perfect scenario, but no guarantees that'll happen. And the last guy we'll look at is Devin Cabuto, first round pick from a year ago, 2035. 5-3 this year in rookie ball, but a 5.71 ERA. Similar theme to a lot of our other younger pitching prospects. The control hasn't developed yet, walked 58, and he also gave up 10 homers in 63 innings. So he's got good stuff when he gets it over the plate. The question is how often he's going to get it over the plate for us. So as we sit here at the beginning of the offseason, feel like we're in a pretty decent spot with our farm system. Obviously, it's very highly regarded. A year from now, with the top 2 guys in the farm system likely to be major leaguers, don't know how it's going to look at that point. I think we probably need some more random positive development like we got with Joe Gallagher over the last couple of years to really help move us in the right direction. And maybe we'll find a gem prospect in international amateur free agency this upcoming year as well. And you never know what could happen in the draft next year. But once again, we will be picking towards the end of the first round, so that will certainly limit our ability to add someone who out of the gate is considered a true blue chip can't miss prospect. And turning to an international amateur free agent prospect that we really liked many years ago, but we decided to go in a different direction, and it seems like it worked out. Derek Boot was a guy who signed with the Cubs for a big bonus back in 2025. Was one of the top prospects in baseball for a long time. Unfortunately, he just retired after this year. He had played the last 3 years in independent ball. Never actually made it to the majors. Had 67 games in AAA Iowa with the Cubs system. Hit 167 in a very small sample size in 2032 and 223 3 years ago. Never made it to the majors. And with the fact that he's retired, Derek Boot never will make it to the majors. So I'll have to go back and look at who we went after in international amateur free agency in that 2025 season instead of Boot. But turned out to be a good miss by us, assuming that we wouldn't have gotten lucky with much better development from him than he got with the Cubs organization. And through a little bit of detective work, I've come to discover that the guy we went with that year instead of Derek Boot was the pitcher Jorge Carrillo, who is headed into free agency now. But he was our big international free agency signing in that 2025 season, and we actually only ended up spending $500,000 on him, which we thought was a good deal at the time. So he wasn't the biggest signing we had that year. But if I remember correctly, I think that was a year where we sprayed some money at Carrillo and another pitcher or two early. And when they signed with us, that guaranteed that we weren't going to be able to get Derek Boot. So Carrillo has had a nice career for us. It may be over in Buffalo at this point, but 64 and 26 with a 3.70 ERA, almost a strikeout per inning. Led the league in games once out of the bullpen, and then wins as a starter. And the last 3 years as a starter for us, he's a combined 52 and 14. He's an Iron Man. He's a guy that we would love to have back, looking for about $15.5 million a year. Just not sure if we can afford to do it, but certainly ending up with Carrillo rather than Derek Boot that year worked out well for us. Josh Blevins is a guy we considered taking number 1 overall the year that we ended up taking Deshaun Seifu number 1 overall. So that was another decision that worked out well for us. And thanks again to those of you who helped push us in that direction many months ago in real time. Blevins, 28 years old, split this year between the Cubs and the Orioles, combined for 7 homers and 26 ribbies with a 271 average for those two teams. The Cubs ended up waiving him, and he was picked up by Baltimore. Looking at his profile, don't think he's ever going to be a star. He's just kind of a guy, and when you factor in the fact that he's just kind of a guy and he's pretty awful defensively, that explains why he's never really caught on, and closing in on 29 years old, probably never will. A guy who we really liked in the draft in 2027, and because we were a very new expansion team at the time, we actually had the opportunity to pick and passed on, was Roman Maples, who has become a Gold Glove winning and an all-star shortstop for Kansas City. Has struggled offensively the last couple years after a nice start to his career, been a below-average offensive player each year. That said, he's still putting up around a 3 WAR, a pretty solid defensive shortstop. The guy that we picked instead of him is a name that those of you who have been watching over the years are familiar with. We ended up going with Ali Ostendorf, number 2 overall. We ended up trading him away several years ago to the Braves. He finally seems to have put it together a bit at the major league level this year, 13-10 with a 3.67 ERA. We ended up beating Ali and the Braves in the playoffs this year. So he finally looks like he is a solid, respectable major league starter. Still think probably would have been the right decision to take Maples over him, but neither of them are part of our organization at this point. Mike Moore is a college player out of the University of Oregon, or was a college player out of the University of Oregon in the 2031 draft that we had highlighted in our annual draft review as a player that we would have loved to pick at number 23 overall. Unfortunately, he went number 22 overall to the Mariners, and he is part of a very high-quality rotation in Seattle at this point. 15-7 with a 2.99 ERA this year. He is a 2-time All-Star. Ben Pickle is a college player that I highlighted several years ago in the draft. I didn't like him as much as a couple of viewers did. He's had a up and down career. He's almost 27 years old now. He was waived by Nashville this past January. Spent the whole year in Cleveland where he hit 263, 25 doubles, 10 homers. Slightly below average offensive player. At his age, he probably is what he is at this point. He's at least competent defensively in left or right field. Has a pretty good personality. So probably a guy who is going to be in the majors for several years, but in a best case scenario, he's a fourth outfielder / pinch hitter type rather than somebody that I think you'd want to be starting every day. Mike Goodwin is a prospect that I famously described as Deshaun Seifu Jr., or a poor man's Deshaun Seifu when he was available in the draft, but in retrospect, it's kind of worked out that way. Split this year between AAA and the majors, hit 249 with 10 doubles, 2 triples, and 2 homers in 169 at-bats with the Astros. Once again, was a below-average offensive player at the major league level, although he's got incredible speed. He was 13 for 13 on the base paths in the majors this year. Just doesn't hit incredibly and is not all that great defensively, but he certainly does bring some positive traits into the locker room. And last but not least, Jorge Rente was an international free agent, international amateur free agent at the beginning of this year. A pitching prospect that we loved. Unfortunately, he went for $5.7 million to Montreal, so we were unable to compete for him. But they put him, even though he was only 17 years old, right into their DSL team. Was 1-1 with a 6.20 ERA, but the performance on the field really doesn't matter at this point. He's not even 18 years old. Viewed as the 58th best prospect in baseball. Still viewed as someone who could have incredible stuff, excellent movement, and above-average control with excellent stamina and ability to hold runners. 17 years old, and he's throwing in the mid-90s. Still very interested in seeing exactly how Rente develops over the next 5 or so years in the Expos organization. And before we finish off the episode, we'll check in on some of our former players. Jace Barofin was the first-round draft pick in the history of the Buffalo organization. Has had 2 stints in Buffalo, the second of which was just for a year last season. And he's now had 2 years with the Yankees as he ended up signing with the Yankees right when the season began this year. Hit 235, did have 21 homers and 23 doubles, but was still a slightly below average offensive player. At 35 years old, his career is likely nearing its end. He's going to be a free agent again, it looks like, over the course of his career at this time. He's had a solid major league career, 231 home runs. He's been in the big leagues for over a decade at this point. So a nice career, definitely more productive with the Yankees at this point than he was with Buffalo. More home runs with the Yankees in almost the exact same number of at-bats. It's kind of crazy. Only a 2 at-bat difference between the two teams. More homers with the Yankees, and overall a higher WRC plus and OPS plus with the Yankees. But he's been a similar player in aggregate between the two teams, although it looks like his WAR is materially better with his time with the Yankees, even though some of his offensive statistics look only a little bit worse. Vance Honeycutt is a draft pick of ours from UNC from many years ago at this point, who ended up developing really well. He was, I believe, a mid-round kind of pick. 8th round pick for us. So he developed really well, and for a time, he was probably our top offensive player. A really good bat and a lot of speed on the base paths and pretty proficient at stealing bases. But by the time he was headed into free agency, it had a couple of poor years in a row, at least by his standards. And he was also heading towards being wrecked physically. So this past year with Atlanta, he hit .210 with 16 homers and 491 at-bats. Still was able to steal 18 bases, but you can see he played only 55 games the year before. And even in 2034, his first year in Atlanta, played just 122 games. So he's not a guy you can count on being in the lineup every day. See, those first 4 or 5 years with us, he was a excellent offensive player, and then he dipped to being a slightly above average offensive player his last 2 years with us when his batting averages started to dip. And unfortunately for the Braves, his batting averages haven't really recovered that much. He's a .235 career hitter for Atlanta, so that lines up pretty well with the .238 and .236 numbers he put up his last 2 years in the Buffalo organization before we decided to let Atlanta pay him big money in his 30s. And Chris Sabatka is a pitcher who we made a big trade with the Dodgers for several years ago and really thought he was going to be the cornerstone of our organization. But he had some injury issues, and then our scout kind of questioned what he was going to be looking like on the other side of those injuries. So we decided to trade him away for Drake Purvis, who we ultimately ended up trading away for Alexis Barajas in a monster deal that we'll talk about shortly. So it all ended up working out for us. Sabatka split the year between the Angels and the Padres. Was a combined 11 and 14. Would be easier than me trying to add this up in my mind just to look at his totals for the year. The 11 and 14 was easy to do. 3.71 ERA, solid. Above average ERA plus and FIP minus. So a nice solid year. Not as productive as he was for us in Buffalo, where he led the league in wins both seasons with us before he had a major injury, and we moved on from him. So I think that we probably, since ultimately Barajas is a guy that we got for him, now granted we had to add in tons of other talent to make that happen, I think it worked out reasonably well for us, but good to see Sabatka also having some success in his career away from us too. And the year after we let Vance Honeycutt leave and sign with the Braves, we let Cam Collier leave, and he happened to sign with the Braves as well. And he's basically been having Cam Collier seasons with the Braves. 249 this year, 11 homers and 502 at-bats. So that 106 WRC plus is the borderline low end of a Cam Collier year. Still put up a 3 WAR. Just decided he was going to be a little too expensive for us to keep. He hasn't done poorly for Atlanta, but hasn't done quite as well as he did with us. The way the timing worked out, where we kind of had his age 26, 27, 28, and 29 years after he made won't say a huge trade, but a significant trade with the White Sox to bring him on board. Feel like we kind of got the best of Collier, and he was with us for our first World Series championship a couple of years ago. And another guy who was with us for our first World Championship 2 years ago was Andrew Painter. He was a longtime member of our starting rotation. Also spent some time, particularly one season, as a really effective arm out of our bullpen in a stopper role. Moved on from him and let him leave as a free agency at the age of 33 this past offseason. He combined for a 4-11 record between the Mets and the Pirates. Pirates picked him up right before the trade deadline. 4.17 combined ERA, pretty average profile for about $10 million. Still a respectable major league pitcher, but not really the type of guy that we can be affording to spend $10 million a year on anymore in Buffalo. And the last three Buffalo Wings that we'll check in on are the three players that were kind of the cornerstones of the deal that brought us our ace, Alexis Barajas. Drake Purvis, a good left-handed starting pitcher, 14-7 with a 2.51 ERA this year for the Marlins. League best 2.67 BABIP and a 4.5 WAR, which I believe may be the best of his career. Yeah, actually it's not. It was 4.9 a year before in Miami. So he's had the best 2 seasons of his career in Miami after we traded him away. As I've talked about, we got Barajas for him, so I think it's worthwhile, although Barajas is starting to get expensive heading into his final arbitration-eligible season, and we're going to have to figure out how to get him signed as a free agent, or hopefully before he hits free agency, either sign him to an extension this offseason instead of going through the arbitration process with him, or probably more likely just getting him signed to a 1-year deal now, and then a year from now trying to get him locked up before he can hit free agency. But Purvis certainly was not easy for us to get rid of. But given that, as I mentioned, we got Barajas in return, and Barajas is a couple years younger, Iron Man, and was 17-7 this year with a league best 2.39 ERA. I think that trade still worked out in our favor, although, as I mentioned, Barajas looking at $21-22 million in arbitration this year. And let's see how ugly it is if we want to go for a long-term contract with him. Yeah, looking for 8 years at $309 million to get a long-term deal done. So that is a bridge that we will have to cross since we do want to keep Barajas around, but it's going to be expensive. Juan Villapando was a infield prospect we picked in the 3rd round many years ago. We included him in the trade also. Interestingly, looks like the Marlins did not protect him in the Rule 5 draft, and the Reds picked him up this past year. And he had a pretty nice rookie year for the Reds. Hit .282, 26 doubles, 19 homers, 22 steals, 114 WRC plus, and a 3 WAR. So a pretty useful, utility-ish type guy. Wonder if they were using him at a regular position somewhere or kind of all over the field. Primarily at second base, where he started 89 games, but he did start 28 in right, 8 in left, and 3 in center field as well. So pretty nice rookie year for Villapando. Wasn't incredibly efficient on the base paths, but for a Rule 5 pick, a pretty productive season, and looks like the Marlins did not get much of a return on him, letting him go so quickly. And Dave Zapp was another one of the real key players in that trade for Barajas. He was a guy that we had drafted number 5 overall, so we invested a lot of draft capital into him. And I think we got out at about the right time on him. Still think he could have some decent home run power. He hit 310 for AAA Jacksonville this year with 40 homers. So clearly doesn't have anything left to prove at the major league level. But just 5 at-bats with the Marlins this year. Did have 2 hits. Very small sample size at this point over the course of his major league career. Struggled a couple years ago with Miami, and then looks like he finally might have gotten back up this September. Will be interesting to see if he's a big part of their future. Probably not at this point. Looks like most likely he's a 4th or 5th outfielder. So that was probably a bad pick of us at number 5 overall, but probably good in being able to extract some value in Barajas for him while he likely had more value than he does today. Wonder what we think his scouting report looked like back when we made that trade. That was midway through the 2034 season. So we still thought he had 4-star potential when we traded him away, and kind of think he's a 2.5-star guy at this point. So seems like that one worked out reasonably well for us as well when all was said and done. And now, with our review of our minor league system and some former players and some former prospects done, and the recap of our season completed in the previous episode, now it's going to become time for us to actually start getting some of the serious work done at the end of this episode and the beginning of our next episode for this coming off season. We've got about $30 million to spend, thanks to Generette opting out of his contract. And we've still got 2 more decisions to make as far as players where we have team options that we need to think about exercising. And appreciate all of the thoughts from viewers over the past several days in terms of what we should do with some of those option decisions and what we should do with some of the free agent decisions that we have in front of us. We've already decided to exercise Hayden Yinger's option for $1.6 million. Generette, as we talked about, exercised his option to opt out of his contract. Harleen Susana is a pitcher who's been good for us for many years at this point. We picked him up in a trade with Washington almost 7 years ago, and he was a longtime starter for us, has worked out of the bullpen the last couple years. 4.13 career ERA, been a slightly above average pitcher according to his ERA plus and FIP minus. But the option for him next year is for $10 million. And realistically for us, he's probably a 5th starter next year. And if we bring Carrillo back, he's not even in the rotation. Now, there's no guarantees that we can bring Carrillo back, but letting Susana go and not paying him $10 million does open up a lot more options for us. So we are going to go ahead and void that last contract year on Harleen Susana and let him go. And that brings us to the always controversial James Wood, who has been a below average or perfectly average offensive player for us the 2 years that he's been on our team. He hasn't been a perfect solution in center field, given that he's not as good defensively as guys like Gaglia and Hardage, who are younger, that we've been playing him over. But he has been good on the base paths. He's been successful on 26 of 28 stealing attempts for us. He's hit 32 homers for us. And he still has some pop in his bat, particularly against right-handed pitching. But he's 34 years old. He's fragile physically. And despite his postseason heroics for us this year, where he had 7 homers and 49 at-bats, most of them clearly solo shots because he only had 10 ribbies total. I think it's time for us to move on from James Wood. If he happens to linger on the free agent market again, and we can pick him up for $2.5 million 3 or 4 months from now, and we feel like he could be additive to our team, I can't rule out a reunion with him, but I don't want to commit a guaranteed $4 million to him for next year. So we're going to void James Wood's last contract year also. And the positive thing about both of those moves is that it's opened up about $40 million for us now to spend this coming off season. You can see that with contracts increasing into the future. We still have a little bit less flexibility for the longer term, but that does put us in a position where we've got some options for the next couple of weeks before free agency begins. And the 3 big things we need to think about as we approach free agency is 1, do we want to try to bring Carrillo back for multiple years at $15 million-ish a year? Like that he's an Iron Man. Like that the fans love him. Like that he's got some good personality traits in the clubhouse. And most importantly, like that he's a good, solid pitcher. He's got a 5-pitch arsenal. His stuff, his movement and control aren't incredible. But over the course of his major league career, his postseason career has been rough with a 6.02 ERA. Probably should factor that in also. But over the course of his major league career, he's put up a 112 ERA plus and a 91 FIP minus for us. Admittedly, in most cases, he's been probably a little bit more effective out of the pen than than as a starter. But I actually don't even know if that's true anymore, looking at these last 3 years with 80, 88, and 96 FIP minuses. It's borderline whether he's a $15 million a year pitcher, but he is a Iron Man potential innings eater who's probably going to go out and start 32, 33, 34 games for us if we want, win a lot of games if we put a good offense behind him. So he is in the mix to consider, but the real big decision is, do we try to re-engage with Shamar Jenneret, who opted out of the last 4 years of his deal and is looking for about $40 million a year for 7 years? He's going to be 32 years old before the season starts. He's been a monster for us, leading the league in ribbies 3 straight years, and as we've talked about many times now in the last few episodes, 2 World Series MVP awards and a regular season MVP award across those 3 years with us. So he has been fantastic. But as I also talked about with a guy like Gallagher coming up through the system, feel like we've got a potential replacement at DH who's 80% of the bat that Jenneret is and is a lot younger, and is going to cost us about 1/50th of what Jenneret will cost us next year. So I think I'm inclined to not make an offer to Jenneret, but I do have to be realistic. This is a team that had made the playoffs 6 consecutive years without him and never got further than the NLCS because our home run power was usually lacking compared to most of the teams in the National League. And as soon as we brought him on board, the worst we've done is get to the NLCS, which was previously the best we'd ever done. And we've also won a couple of World Series. So it's going to leave a hole in the lineup if we move on from him. If we do make that decision, my hope is that Gallagher can fill that hole. And then the last guy we need to think about is Deshaun Seifu, number 1 overall pick who has grown up in our team. He was drafted number 1 out of Fordham in 2026, and he made his major league debut that September. So he is the only guy left who has been with our major league team every year in the history of the Buffalo organization. And kind of strangely, for a player with speed, you could argue that his last 5 years in his late 20s and early 30s have been better than his first 5 years of his career when he was in his mid-20s. No guarantee that that's going to continue. And he is a guy at this point who is a mediocre second baseman and a maybe slightly better than mediocre defensive third baseman. He does have those 2 Gold Glove awards that surprised the heck out of me early in his career. He's not looking for the same kind of money as Jenneret, but still looking for almost $27 million a year and 7 years. Given that he's so reliant on speed, I worry that when that speed goes, his value could crater, because it's all on the base paths with him, and being able to generate stupid amounts of extra base hits with that great gap power combined with his great speed. So when the speed goes, he's not going to be as good stealing bases, where he's led the league 9 straight years, and that gap power, which is his superpower as an offensive player, is not going to matter as much. I do have interest in seeing what this career would look like. And obviously I can see what his career would look like if I let him go and watch him with another team. But I do think for an expansion team, it would be kind of cool to have a guy that we picked number 1 overall spend his whole career with us. And he's closing in on 2,000 hits. And he's closing in on 1,000 career steals. He should get 2,000 hits next year. Probably won't get to 1,000 career steals till late in the 2039 season or early 2040, perhaps, even if he stays healthy. But that would put him number 2 all time behind only the great Rickey Henderson. So I think there's a lot of interesting storylines to follow with Deshaun Seifu. And even if we try to bring him back, it certainly doesn't mean that we can't also try to bring back Estrada. It certainly doesn't mean that we can't also try to extend Barajas at some point. Sorry, I said bring back Estrada. I meant bring back Carrillo or extend Barajas. And honestly, it doesn't mean that we can't try to also bring back Jenneret. Now, we're going to need to find probably $30 million-ish to be able to bring back Jenneret. And I responded to a recent comment from Patrick DeBonis on this topic in the comments to our last episode. We could open up that kind of money if we wanted to pull our scouting budget down to $10 million and our player development budget down to $15 million. That frees up $27.5 million right there. If we wanted to pare them back even further to both below baseline or even at baseline, that's opening up about $30 million for us. So we can make it work, but with the success we're finally having in terms of our farm system delivering us I don't want to say a perfectly steady stream of guys who can contribute at the major league level, but definitely delivering some guys who have become important parts of our team at the major league level. I don't know that I want to just pull back on scouting and player development, but we're obviously still a win now team. And bringing back both Jenneret and Seifu would give us the best probability of continuing to win now next year. So one way to do that is to just rip our scouting and player development budgets apart I don't want to do that. So the other obvious option when we look at who's signed for next year, there's really only two big numbers on the team, Juan Estrada and Bobby Bolig. And if we moved on from one of them, it's about 15 million. If we moved on from both of them, we can save about $31 million next year and then even more in future years to come. The issue is that Estrada is our excellent two-way player, led the league in ERA a year ago, slightly down year pitching this year for us. But as a batter, he had his best offensive year ever, hitting .345 for us with a ridiculous 35 doubles in 333 at-bats. Scored 53 runs, drove in 60, put up a 145 WRC plus. So moving on from Estrada hurts both our offense and our pitching staff. Bobby Bolig is a guy who had a down year by his standards, 275 with just 18 homers. And his number is starting to get higher next year at 15 million, and he's going to be 15 to 20 million for these next several years. He's been a very productive offensive player for us since we brought him over in a big trade with Pittsburgh. You can see 277 average, 94 home runs in 4 seasons, 123 WRC plus for us. So a very productive offensive player, but he's coming off of a bit of a down year. But looking at his ratings against right-handed pitchers, which is going to be who you're facing 70 to 80% of the time in most seasons, he's still a pretty productive hitter. So we'd be losing a lot giving up his left-handed bat. And that's the other thing that stinks about even thinking about this, is that although it would potentially allow us to bring back a big left-handed bat in Generette, moving on from both Estrada and Bolig basically leave us with Generette's a right-handed hitter, so I'm mixing my explanation here, but we're kind of light on left-handed hitters anyways, particularly with the fact that we've opted out of Wood right now. Bolig, Steve Anderson, and Heiner are the three guys who are usually in the lineup, and then we've got Estrada. So we're basically giving up two of our left-handed bats left with Estrada and Bolig if we move on from both of those guys to open up room for Generette, which just makes us even more right-handed hitting centric. And then there's clearly the compromise option, which would probably be to try to trade away Bolig and also cut our scouting and development budgets materially, but not right to the bone. That would allow us to think about bringing Generette back as well. So we have a lot of options available to us as this offseason begins. And clearly with the amount of money we have available, another thing to at least think about is who the upcoming free agents are going to be. And interestingly, Generette and Seifu are two of the top handful of potential free agents available, not surprisingly. Dylan Cruz, a guy who would not consider a trade to us this past year. Colton Sims, who we had thought about picking up as a free agent a couple years ago. Jerry Miller, and Joey Moore, who briefly played for us the year that we won our first World Series, are some of the other big-time hitters who are likely to be available or possibly available this offseason. Taking a look at the top pitchers who are available, former closer for us a year ago, Chris Staten, who spent half a season with us after we picked him up in a trade. Looks like he could be out there. A lot of pitchers available. Taking a look at the potential starting pitchers. And Carrillo, looking for one of the bigger price tags. Walbert Urena, Simon Pacheco, and Dylan McCall are the three guys looking for the biggest bucks. And they all look like pretty big time pitchers. They're all older, in their mid 30s, so a little older than Carrillo, but certainly Carrillo at 15 and a half as opposed to 18, 25, 22, actually closer to 26 for Pacheco. They're probably all looking for about the right amount of money, which is what you'd expect from a game like this. And there's no guarantees that we have to go for a starting pitcher, even if we let Carrillo go, because we do have young Mr. Alexis Mendoza, who we talked about, who could fill his spot in the rotation if he does come back healthy and relatively effective from that injury. So some of the big free agent prizes out there are guys on our team. And we're not going to decide on everything right now. But one thing that I am going to decide on before the end of this episode is that we are going to try to bring Deshaun Seifu back. I recognize that his speed, now that he's 32 years old, could drop off materially in the next few years. And I recognize that he's looking for full value with the numbers he's looking for. I don't think it's necessarily a obviously incorrect decision to bring Seifu back instead of Jenneret. And as we've talked about, there's still potential to bring them both back if I get more creative with trades and budgets and payroll. But even if it might not be a perfectly optimal decision to bring him back, part of playing the game this way is to tell an interesting story in addition to just demonstrating how to hopefully at times play the game well and efficiently. And I really want to see what Seifu can do over the rest of his career, and whether we can get a player to 3,000 hits in OOTP, whether we can get him to 1,000 steals. And I don't think he can catch Ricky, especially as he gets older. If he steals 86 bases a year for the next 5-6 years, it starts getting close though. But that's the most stolen bases he's had in a year since he was 24 years old. So I can't imagine he's going to be as good as he was this year ever again. But I want to see what we can do with Seifu. I want to keep him around. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to offer him exactly what he's looking for. Almost $27 million a year for 7 years with a player option for the final season and a no trade clause. I'm going to offer him less money and fewer years and more optionality for us here in Buffalo. And hopefully I won't make him angry. I'd like to bring him back, but I want to try to do it in a somewhat responsible fashion. But I also don't want to make him so angry that he won't talk to us. All right, I'm not quite sure what Mr. Seifu is going to think of this offer. He was looking for $26.9 million a year for 7 years with a player option in the final season and a no trade clause. I'm thinking about offering him $24 million a year for 5 years with team options for the last 2 seasons and no trade clause. I feel like the money might be good enough. I don't know that the no trade clause being removed, the years that we've cut this down to, and the team options that really make it a 3-year contract with 2 1-year options tacked on the end of it is going to work for him. But I also don't think it's a complete insult. He wants the no trade clause. It looks like he's willing to do a 5-year deal, although he wants a player option in the end. But I think we might be able to get something done here. I want to include those team options. To me, those team options for the final seasons are more important than the no trade clause. So I'm going to try to come up with something. He did come down to 26.4, so he came down by $500,000 or so a year. So I don't think we're too far off. All right, so he came down $500,000 a year in what he was looking for. We're up $500,000 a year in what we're offering him, and we're offering him $24.5 million for 5 years. We're putting team options in years 4 and 5 as opposed to the player option in team 5 that he wanted. So although we came up in money, we didn't really come back at all in terms and conditions, except we did include the no trade clause, which he asked for. So we'll see what he thinks. And apparently my numbers were not quite high enough on the payouts for those buyouts. So we'll give him a few extra pennies there if we have to get out of this contract. And I also upped the MVP and All-Star award amounts slightly for him. I don't think those really have a big factor in negotiations based on my experience, but so will $24.5 million a year for 5 years get it done? I guess that buyout, I thought it was always kind of needed to be 10% or more, but apparently it needs to be 2.6 million for some reason. So what does he think of it now? Not quite enough. He is coming down in money. He really wants that player option, but he's moving in our direction. We're not too far away. Getting to the point where we probably got to get it done soon, though. All right, he's come down again in money to 25.6. We're going to go up to 25 million a year for the next 5 years. We're giving him the player option that he wants in year 5, but we're still keeping a team option in year 4. So essentially, we've still got the call on whether we want him for 2 years at 50 million in his mid-30s. But then if things are going really well, he's got the option to opt out. I don't know if that'll get us there. It means that decision after year 3 is essentially a 2-year decision for us potentially at that point. And I keep not putting enough in that buyout. I'm a very slow learner. And he's willing to think about it. So it would be 5 years, 125 million. We've got ability to get out after the 3rd year. He's got the ability to get out after the 4th year. But it potentially guarantees that we keep him for the rest of his prime if we want him. And if he's still the same player or a pretty close player 4 or 5 years from now than he is today, I think it'll be pretty good value for us. Not as good as a contract as we had him signed to when he was younger. But we're going to submit that offer to Mr. Seifu. 5 years, 125 million. Clearly that limits our financial flexibility right now. We could certainly bring back Carrillo with that amount. And as I talked about, we'd have to make some trades and or cuts to the budget. And we actually, now that we are through the season, need to up our international amateur free agent budget that we didn't spend last year back there. So that takes away a little of our money. So we could easily bring back Carrillo. We could still try to bring back Jenneret if we cut this budget and or thought about trading away Heiner and or Estrada. So there's still more levers that we need to think about and still more levers that we need to press. But we're going to try to ensure that we've got another 3 to 5 years of Deshaun Seifu on the team. And hopefully we'll find out whether he ultimately agrees to that contract in our next episode. Until then, if you've got ideas on what we should be doing outside of bringing back Seifu, would love to hear them in the comments down below. And until our next episode, thank you so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.